Hello and welcome to the Health and Wellbeing Board. An additional meeting was agreed last time. Just to remind everybody that the meeting will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube. If you do want to speak, just raise your virtual hand, and because I don't really follow the messages very well during it, so we'll use hands. So apologies for absence.
Apologies, Councillor Paul Watling.
Okay. Declarations of interest, I'll take a no comment as none. No, okay. Minutes of the previous meeting, anybody? No, just to note that last time there were some questions asked of Jo Leahy and we couldn't get her to respond because she wasn't at the next one. So I did send a letter to Dave Evans and I've had a response. So if anybody would like my letter and Dave's response, I'll email them out to you. Any public speakers? No? Okay. So we'll move on to item 5, which is list note for the local outbreak prevention and control plan.
Thank you, Kelly. If I plan to do a presentation, so if I just share with you. No, that's the wrong one. Kieran, can you share the presentation? Because clearly I failed that attempt.
Yes, just bear with me 1 second. Would you mind sharing with me and I'll get it up?
Oh, let me just see if I can try again, sorry. I emailed it to you this morning.
Yes, my apologies.
I think I can share it now. Shall I try?
Yes, I've got it ready if it doesn't work.
Have I got... Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, apologies for that, members. So yes, so we've set up this Health and Wellbeing Board to look at a local outbreak prevention and control plan for COVID. So each council is to has to develop such a plan, and we published it on our website at the end of June. First point I'd like to make is that this is about prevention as well as controlling of outbreaks. And it's really key that we all recognise how a proactive approach can prevent outbreaks, as well as the need to have a swift response when we do have outbreaks. Just so that everybody understands that at this point in the pandemic, outbreaks are an inevitable stage of the pandemic. And therefore, that's why all councils need to be prepared and have these outbreak control plans in place. Have I shared? Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to start off by sharing with you some of the information around the pandemic that we have to date, so that board members are fully aware. So this slide is actually the number of positive cases there have been within the borough since, at the top slide, since the beginning of the pandemic. So overall, we've had 594 cases in total. But what you can see, what's most important is that we understand what the current rate of infection is. And so that we look at the 7-day infection rate. And in the 7 days between the 29th of June and the 5th of July, we had 6 cases within the borough. And that gave us a rate of 3.4 per 100,000. That rate, you can see on the graph underneath, is slightly lower than the national average. And this is what particularly I'll be monitoring, and others will be monitoring literally on a daily basis. Cumulatively, just to point out, all the cases. I'm getting a lot of background noise, so I don't know whether somebody's got something not on mute. Okay. Cumulatively, the rate of infection within the borough, if we add up all the cases since the beginning of the pandemic, the rate is low compared to the national and the West Midland average, but still a very significant issue for our boroughs, we recognise. The next slide is actually the number of outbreaks that we've been notified of since the beginning of the pandemic. So we have a total here of 21 outbreaks notified to us since the start. Mostly they have been in care homes, as most of members will recognise. So we've had about 15 in care homes, but more recently we are picking up outbreaks in other settings. And this is what we've been notified of and are working with Public Health England in terms of addressing. Okay. And then sadly, this is the last slide in terms of data. Sadly, we have had a significant number of deaths within the borough from COVID-19. This is the deaths of all our residents, whether they took place within the borough or outside of the borough. So this is the ONS information. It does have a time lag, so it's week commencing the 26th of June is the last week. We do have more up-to-date information, but that's about those deaths that are registered within the borough, and therefore we won't know when residents die outside of the borough. So this is information I choose to share with you. Sadly, this information is that we've had 100 deaths of our residents up until this point in time. And you can see that the peak of the pandemic was in the middle of April with 4 weeks of a significant number of deaths. And then it's dropped down. And now we are usually 1 or 2 deaths per week. I'll just say further on that, you see in the national press that there is information on excess deaths. We do monitor that as well. And in terms of that is where we've had more deaths compared to our 5-year average position. And that's not just solely due to COVID. So we've monitored that position in terms of excess deaths from other causes as well. And they showed a very similar pattern to the COVID deaths. And at the moment, we're in a position where largely we don't have any excess deaths or very few. Okay, moving on then to the outbreak prevention and control plan. I think I said at the beginning, the important bit is that it's about a proactive approach in terms of prevention first. And that's about us working to make sure our residents understand the key public health messages about social distancing, hand hygiene, and if they have symptoms to isolate and get tested. And then secondly, the containment of outbreaks, and that's how we would respond in terms of making sure we can identify all those affected, make sure we have contact tracing taking place, isolation and infection control advice. So I just wanted to draw members' attention to the fact that we now have the Telford and Wrekin Health Protection Hub set up. This is operational. I have environmental health officers as well as public health officers working with Nikki Minshall, our service delivery manager, and Helen Onions, our consultant in public health, both of who I would like to thank for all the hard work they've done in terms of both putting this plan together, but also actually responding to situations as we have done over the last month to 6 weeks. So this hub is about giving that proactive advice and guidance to businesses, to care homes, to schools, to the members of the public, but then also in terms of when we have either single cases in complex situations or indeed an outbreak to be able to respond, working with Public Health England and other partners across the system. The plan was around, we had 7 key themes for the plan, which are on the left-hand side of that slide, around support for care homes and schools, understanding our high-risk places and communities and locations, understanding how we would test within an outbreak, that we have sufficient capacity around contact tracing, importantly the data integration issue, which I'll come on to, and then if somebody who is vulnerable needs to isolate, we would need to be able to support them if they haven't got any support networks themselves. In terms of risks to delivery, I think key risks are around compliance with actually the public health advice, the national NHS test and trace. So it's really important that we get our messages out to the public and to all our settings. Secondly, data. So in terms of, I've shared with you some of the information that I have. So I do have data, but what we don't have is the individual, we don't have information on each and every case and contact, whereby we can then understand the linkages between them. And that's really important in terms of making sure we understand the patterns of infection across the borough. But clearly I do have the number of cases and I have information, a certain amount of information on each of those. And then testing delays. I'll be pleased to hear that actually testing delays, we have 2 types of testing that can take place. That which is organised by our local NHS and that which is organised through the national testing route. And for us, that's through Ironbridge Park and Ride. The time it takes for getting results has actually improved more recently, because that's really important in terms of once somebody does think they're symptomatic and needs to isolate, that they get their results quickly, and that has improved. In terms of governance, so we have set up a Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin COVID Health Protection Board that I chair, working with Shropshire's Director of Public Health, Rachel Robinson, and with system partners, particularly in the NHS Infection Control, CCG, Community Trust and Acute Trust. And then each local authority, and for us Telford and Wrekin, is to develop a local outbreak engagement board, and ours will be meeting shortly and will be chaired by Councillor Andy Burford. And then I just thought I'd end with how I started by saying the key to this is actually the prevention agenda and making sure we all know how we can play our part to prevent outbreaks. And this is really important in terms of making sure both our residents understand this, but also we are working with lots of different businesses, with schools, with care homes, to proactively communicate with them around how to be COVID secure, and B, what to do if there's a case or an outbreak. I think I'll close there, Kelly, and then I'll take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Is anybody? Oh, yeah, there's some hands. Andy?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Just really, first of all, to congratulate Liz and all the staff on this plan. I think it's a good plan. It holds together well. It covers all the bases, I think, and also to say how throughout this pandemic, I think we've been striving to be ahead of the curve. Right from the early stages, we've recognised where our potential for outbreaks was. We have been proactive in making sure that those premises, whether they be schools, care homes, or factories, were advised and were encouraged to do what was required. Right from the start, we've been ahead on that, and we were also very much to the fore on the issue in care homes in terms of resisting the discharge from hospital when we know what a perilous thing that was at the height of the pandemic. So I think we've got reason to be satisfied at the approach we've taken so far. I'll just say, and I know Liz will echo this, that there is absolutely no room for complacency here. Our low rate of 3.4%, you know, the figure that she gave in terms of cases per 100,000, it isn't set in stone. It can easily change, and we've got to keep a very careful eye on that. The only thing I would say is that you can expect that rate to jump around without it being a cause for concern, because the number of cases we're concerned with are at the moment are so small that even 1 or 2 cases will cause that 3.4 to jump up maybe to near 10 without that being in any way indicative of some kind of rising curve. So we must prevent alarm on that count, I think, if that happens. And I mean, one of the things I'd just like to pick up from what Liz said is the importance of the early testing, and that coming through quicker. And it's encouraging to see that is starting to come through quicker, because that's key really to getting on top of local outbreaks, which as Liz says will occur. Well, whatever we however efficient we are at control. So I think it's a good plan, and I'd commend it. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we carry on, sorry, Caro, just because you weren't here when I asked, have you got any declarations of interest before we vote on this? After?
No, I haven't any declarations of interest.
On either item, no. Thank you. Karen?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just a few questions. Obviously, you know, I understand that we need to be proactive rather than reactive, but obviously because of the worries now that things are opening up more and people are going out in these situations, you wear a mask, don't you wear a mask? And I think there's all these things, you know, I think there's a bit of worry about what should you do, what shouldn't you do. So I think there's a little bit of concern there, if that's what the feedback I've received. And also, you know, I think that we have to worry about if there are going to be any spikes. So I suppose I'm just concerned about the test and tracking, as in, you know, I know there's historically now the government not sharing all the data, and I just want to make sure that all that data is being shared. And we also have got the postcodes, because the scenario was that people were being tested, hadn't got the postcode. So how can you trace and track that, where that person's been, if you haven't got all that data, all that information to find out who they've been with, to see who else is going to be infected? I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, but you know, we have to think about the fact that things are opening up more, and let's hope there isn't a second spike, but you just don't know how things are going to pan out really. So I just wondered what your feedback was on that at all. Thank you.
Kelly, do you want me to answer that? Yeah. Okay. Just in terms of, so yes, I do have postcoded level data on the positive cases within the borough. So I have their postcode, their age, and what type of testing that were done. So I can track from a surveillance point of view those rates. I can track from a geographical point of view. But what I don't have is actually their contact details to be able to do the contact tracing myself. That's done at a national level for simple cases, or at a regional, another tier if they're slightly more complex. So in terms of, I don't see the connections, the linkages between the cases and the contacts necessarily until there's perhaps an outbreak. So that was the point I'm making. But certainly I can see postcoded data on cases, but it's those connections between the cases that isn't as visible to me at this point in time.
Can I ask a second question on that? So, do we foresee that will happen at all? Because to me, that's quite a concern. The fact that what happened in Leicester, the fact that if the government aren't giving us more information than locally, then we can't react as quick as we'd like to.
Yeah. I haven't got a crystal ball.
No.
And in terms of giving you the assurance that, from my point of view, from my team, if we do have notification of a case and we are able to contact them, and we do that, we go in and we do that contact tracing as well. In a sense, that is duplicative to what is already being taking place, but in a sense then that I have the complete picture for that particular case. So where I can do that, I do that, and in certain settings because we are notified and people are notifying us of these situations, I can do that on those cases. But it's those cases that aren't in those particular settings that I probably am not as, it's not as visible to me.
Okay.
Thank you. Ian?
Sorry, got to unmute. I read this document with quite a deal of hope that we'd actually be able to do a bit of prevention work and such like. But I was a little bit disappointed at in the outcomes section, which I think is page 8 of the document, there doesn't appear, as usual, any clear and measurable targets and goals so that we can actually check on our progress. Why not?
Sorry, which page are you referring to? Can you?
It's page 8, the outcomes bit.
Okay. I mean, in a sense, what we are tracking is the 7-day infection rates, as Andy has described and I described earlier. So in terms of those are the clear outcomes in terms of what we want to try and reduce within the borough. But Andy's point is well made in terms of, and I said earlier, that we will get variation, there will be spikes, there will be outbreaks, and so the numbers will change. But it's understanding that that level of infection, that 7-day level infection rate within the borough is at a low level. So that is the ultimate outcome that we want to achieve. I'm sorry if that's not very clear within that plan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, just amplifying what Liz was saying there. I mean, the outcome is very obvious, isn't it? We've got to keep hold of this situation in a way that we don't suddenly get the surge that every town and city fears in this country. And you can't have specific targets other than that target. But we've got to keep it at a level where the outbreaks that occur are managed quickly and efficiently. That's what we've been doing so far, and that's what we'll continue to do. I mean, I just think, picking up on Karen's points as well, I mean, I wasn't in any way critical of the way things have been organised centrally when I first spoke, but I will be now. Liz in her answer talked about the way in which we don't get the detail of the contacts. We just get a postcode, so we can see a pattern, but we can't see the individual contacts. I mean, over the last 10 years, we have to recognise that across the country, public health has been cut back drastically. It means that on the ground in localities, we don't have the staff available to do the expert work, which has always been located at local level. It's never been a central government function. It's a local government function, one we do very well. But when it comes to something like this, we're exposed everywhere is exposed in terms of our capacity. So I think we would like because the expertise is here at local level to be doing that contact tracing, which they're trying to do at arm's length from national level. That's not the efficient way of doing it. The efficient way is to have our own resources at local level. But that's been, I'm afraid, been typical of some of the central government control of processes throughout. They haven't recognised that it's locally where this kind of effort really counts. Now, we could cope with that up to a certain level. I think Liz will confirm if we had that detail and we were asked to do it on the individual contacts, we could manage that, and I would suggest we could do it better than an agency could operating at national level. It's questionable when you get a really massive spike whether we would have the capacity, but that's not our fault. That's the result of I'm afraid, and I'll say it again, that's the result of austerity, which has left local councils vulnerable to these kinds of situations. At the moment we can manage it, we would rather manage some of that detailed work at local level. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Caro?
Thank you, Chair. I really welcomed what Liz said about the Health Protection Hub. In common with many businesses and VCSE organisations, we've been going day to day, although I did attend the excellent meeting last week for community groups, and trying to balance out the needs and wants of, in our case, some 100 staff and volunteers all told, who can see on the one hand they can go to the pub, but on the other hand, as a business, particularly one that normally operates an open door service, and that the regulations are very different for businesses. And that's been a considerable effort, and I know that alongside my peers and other colleagues in community and voluntary organisations, we've been taking it day by day. So actually having that hub where we can go for the difficult questions is absolutely brilliant. One thing I would say is, because government advice on the social side and for businesses is out of step, that the key messages are crafted carefully in that respect, because we have to differentiate between what one can do socially and what businesses can do. We're having 15 people a day or more coming to the door and going, why aren't you open? And we want to be open, but we want to be open safely. So just to put a little flag in the sand there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. That's it. So the Health and Wellbeing Board is asked to approve the Telford and Wrekin Local Outbreak Prevention and Control Plan. So I'll take quietness as approval. Yeah, that's that. Thank you. Okay, so item 6, towards integrated care provider arrangements, being presented by David Stout.
Hi everyone, hopefully you can hear me. I'm David Stout, I'm the Chief Exec of Shropshire Community Health Trust. Thank you for inviting me to come to this meeting. Again, I've got a presentation which is in your pack. I can try and load it on the screen. I confess my technical skills are a little rusty. Let's see if we can do that. Was that loaded?
Yeah.
See that?
Yeah. Great, thank you. So I developed this presentation for the Integrated Care Shadow Board, which met earlier in the month, and we had a short conversation about it, but what we agreed was we should test the ideas in it. It's very much a discussion document as it stands. We should test the ideas across the system with different boards and different groups to feed into another discussion at the beginning of August. So Jonathan, I think, suggested this came to the Health and Wellbeing Board as one of the areas and one of the groups we would get input from. So thank you for inviting me. And just to remind people, in terms of a shadow board, the Integrated Care Shadow Board, Andy, Jonathan, Caro, and Dave Evans are all members of that group. So I'm sure can chip into the discussion if we need to. So what I was going to cover was a bit of the background to why we're looking at integrated care, the context of the CCG commissioning strategy, and I recognise some of the language here is very NHS orientated, so I'll try and make sure it makes sense in a local government kind of setting as well. Some thoughts on what integrated care provider arrangements, why we might need them, what the components would be, and the initial views I've had from partners around what the form might be, what the geography might be, what the scope might be, and then open it up for issues for discussion. The background, we did have a conversation about the commissioning strategy that Dave presented back in May, and that strategy, which I'll touch on in a moment, makes some assumptions about how the provider part of the NHS and working with local government might integrate care, and therefore we need to be clear how we are seeking to develop integration across the system in response to the CCG commissioning strategy. It's not a new discussion. There had been some discussions around this back in November and December, but as you might expect, the COVID pandemic has had an impact on our progress. So what felt important was to reignite that discussion, and hence this slide pack. What it represents is just some initial views. So it's far from a completed piece of work. I only spoke to a handful of people, so leaders across the health and care system, and really tested what people's thinking on this topic might be. And what this slide sets out is some of those, a collation of some of those thoughts. As I say, it's not conclusive. It's here to test people's opinions, really. So the background in terms of the commissioning strategy, and Dave can pick up questions around this if there are any, but the basic thrust of a commissioning strategy for the CCGs as they come together to form a single organisation is that the CCGs should step back from some of what you might call micro-commissioning and take a more strategic perspective and be far more focused on outcomes rather than the process of service design. Now that only works if there is an ability to hand over some of that more detailed service design responsibility to the NHS providers and social care working together to step into that space. So if we are to move to a commissioning organisation that is more strategic, we need the provider entities to work together to fill some of the space that would leave inside our local system. So what might the purpose of integrated care provision structures be? Well, fundamentally, it would be about driving forward the ambitions that we set out in the Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin long-term plan, which that little picture, which you won't be able to read, is a kind of one-page plan on a page version of that long-term plan. But in essence, the driver of a long-term plan is that we need to achieve the kind of left shift in the jargon. We start to put more emphasis on prevention, more emphasis on delivering care as close to people's normal place of residence as possible. That has the benefit of having, we would expect, improved outcomes for local people and better use of resources, and as a byproduct would take some of the pressure off the local acute hospital that we know has struggled with the demand that it's faced in recent years. So that's its primary purpose, is to drive forward those ambitions and deliver that better coordinated care, better outcomes and more efficient use of resources. But I've suggested here there might be some secondary purposes. So as I said, in terms of the commissioning strategy, that's stepping back from micro-commissioning, but put in a more positive light from a provider point of view, that we should be delivering the design of services much closer to the point of delivery, that clinically led design, and sorry again for the use of language, clinical, including social care practitioners, led design of services is more likely to be effective than commissioning members of staff who are further from the front line of delivery. And secondly, I think there's undoubtedly, in terms of the national thinking, there is a change in the model of the operating model, for want of a better phrase, that in the last few years under multiple governments has been based on a presumption that competition is how you drive improvement and that procurement is the route by which you secure services. Whereas I think the integrated care model is based on a more collaborative view of life, that you get better outcomes by working together effectively rather than a more market view of life. Well, interested in your views on that, but that is certainly my sense of the way that government policy is developing, and integrated care would be one means of allowing us to achieve that goal. Busy slide, this one, and as I said, we did have some input from PricewaterhouseCoopers in the outset of the initial discussions we had around integrated care, so I've stolen this slide from them. But what this is setting out is what might integrated care provision have to do, what are its key components, and it's suggesting there are three key tasks. Firstly, defining care models and pathways, and we've been doing a lot of that in recent times through COVID, and that really important work, that we are clear what our models are and how those pathways work for people using our services. Secondly, it's about designing a system operating model that allows you to deliver those care pathways effectively. And thirdly, it's about ensuring that incentives are in the right place, that you certainly could argue, many people have, that the kind of NHS incentives of payment by results, for example, has incentivised treating people when actually prevention might be a better model. So an integrated care approach would need to ensure the incentives are in the right place to achieve the goals purpose that I talked about earlier. So then ask questions around form, around scope and around geography. So I'll just take those one at a time. So in terms of form, sort of loosely, I've suggested here there's a spectrum of degrees of formality of the form of integrated care, from the left-hand side of that slide, a very informal, collaborative approach with no formal governance, but encouraging people to work together to deliver services in a more integrated way. The far end, the right-hand side of the spectrum, is a much more structural solution in which you actually bring organisations together, perhaps through mergers or acquisition, to form integrated care, an integrated care organisation. And in the middle, somewhere between those two, is working collaboratively, but with some form of formal shared governance that brings organisations together. So it doesn't require merger or structural change, but it does bind in some form of governance to oversee that collaboration. And testing people's views, generally there's little appetite, or no appetite really, for the far end of that equation, the formal structural change. Generally, people's views were it's best to build trust and confidence by working together informally, and a lot of the COVID experience has been people working in exactly that way, where people have come to rapid and flexible solutions because it was the right thing to do, rather than having a lot of formal governance built around it. But as we build that trust and confidence, that naturally more formality might follow, that you'd start to build some kind of formal governance around that informal working over time, is the general view. That said, there is a view that we need to have accountability. You can't have just random decision making with no accountability, and simply having individual organisations with their own accounts, with their own individual forms of accountability is necessary, but potentially not sufficient. And we do have examples of this already. It's not a completely new idea. So in Telford and Wrekin, we have the Integrated Place Partnership, TWIP, that has a formal board. So we are somewhere in that instance, in that middle box, I think, albeit as far as I'm aware, there isn't formal delegated authority from the individual organisations for decision making. But it's where decision making is produced together. So it's ensuring there's alignment, a strategic approach. More recently, on the NHS side, we've established an MSK Alliance, which is a formal board which is intending to set some agreed risk share and to oversee delivery of a shared service model. So again, that's somewhere in that middle box territory, I think. So you can see this idea of some form of structural accountability, but not going to that formal merger is the territory we're starting to inhabit. In terms of geography, I was kind of setting the question, well, geographically, where does integrated care sit? And Again, this is a slightly simplistic view of the world, but I'm kind of suggesting there are probably at least 4 levels at which integration could take place. The neighbourhood level, so potentially the primary care network level or other locality structures we might have across Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin. Could be at the place level, i.e. the 2 local authority boundaries, so Shropshire or Telford and Wrekin. It could be at the system level, which brings together STW, Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, or it could be at the supra-system level, by which I mean at a bigger footprint than STW. An example of that might be the cancer network, where we know we simply aren't big enough to provide all cancer services within our local patch. So testing views about, well, what level would we want to see integration work? The general view seems to be, well, probably at all those levels. It's not, there isn't one level where integration naturally sits and will always happen. It should be happening at all those levels, is the view I was getting. Potentially, the development of primary care networks is important because while they currently have limited responsibilities, there is an expectation they may grow over time. So it may be we see more integrated care organised at the neighbourhood level over time. Again, one for debate. In terms of scope, again, there's a massive a range of scope that integration could address, anything from very hyper specialist services on the health side all the way through to preventative and voluntary sector services and everything in between, as sort of illustrated in those bullet points. Again, testing the general view is we shouldn't be restrictive about our ambitions around integration. It should be a broad approach. We should be seeking to integrate at the right level with as broad an approach as possible. General sense is that integration, we'd probably want to start around the sort of community-based integration, not restricting that to current community services, but recognising it potentially about both physical and mental health. It's about acute services, it's about preventative services, it's therefore is about voluntary sector and services as well as statutory sector services. But probably in that sort of left shift space is where we're likely to want to accelerate our partnership working as a kind of priority, but not at the expense of thinking about those wider range of services as well. So for discussion, does that sound reasonable? Have I, from those very limited conversations, are the conclusions we're starting to emerge around purpose, function, form, geography and scope, are they the right kind of, do they match your views? Have you got different views? Interested to hear where people are coming from. Is the idea that evolving partnership working is the right way to go, or do we think that we need to accelerate faster than that given the scale of change we're likely to want to achieve? And if so, what else do we need to do to accelerate it? And in terms of that question about kind of form, are we confident that the informal, somewhat evolutionary approach is going to be strong enough at the point that financial constraints come back in and we start to have to make difficult choices about what we prioritise and what we don't prioritise? And then finally, we can come back to all of those questions. Finally, we had a discussion at our chief execs groups about our chief exec group in advance of the ICS Shadow Board to say, okay, if this is on the right lines, what might the next steps be? And so the suggestions there again for discussion are we could we kind of pause some of the work around our MSK alliance. Might be a good idea to get back to that and reignite the ambition. We've had through TWIP and through equivalent structures in Shropshire, we've had a focus on that left shift on supporting, focusing as much as possible on the community side to take pressure off the acute services. Suggestion we get that going again, re-establish the partnership working that we've had in place up till now. That there could be a focus in a specific disease area and started to look at the whole pathway from prevention all the way through to treatment, and the suggestion there it could be around something like diabetes or respiratory services. I think there's a good argument for respiratory services personally, given the COVID context of expectations of increasing respiratory problems for our local populations. And fourthly, around back office, is there more we could do together and around our not front-facing services, and an example there around BI and analytics, where could we get to that single version of the truth where we stop having multiple, or every organisation measuring everything individually and then bringing it together? Could we have a much more integrated approach to that? So Kelly, I'll stop there. Hopefully that's enough to get a conversation going. So it's very much for discussion. There's no conclusions really in this paper. It's kind of testing opinions as much as anything.
Great. Thank you, David. Andy?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I really welcome that paper, David. I think that's extremely useful to that presentation in terms of, you know, a look at where we are now, and it, for me, it hits so many of the right notes in terms of what we've learnt and what we want to preserve and take forward coming out of COVID. I mean, there's always for me an issue of capturing the positive new ways of working that we've had through the COVID. I mean, timing is everything here, and it's really important that we don't sit on this. We can simply agree that everything's worked well, and then come back to it at a later date. That would be a real mistake, I think. We need to. Sorry, got a phone going here. So I think in so many ways this is useful. I mean, in terms of the left shift that David talked about, in terms of a focus on prevention, in terms of stepping back from the kind of micro commissioning, which would be a danger with the new CCG. I think if they try to get into that process of micro commissioning, it's good to see that that's not the intention. It's good to see that we're looking at a more collaborative approach rather than a competitive approach. That the incentives are right. So I think in so many ways this is hitting the right notes. I mean, just a comment on the issue of that spectrum of informal right through to a single organisation. I think it is right that we're talking about how we can build on the informality rather than attempting to change structures. It's always a mistake to launch into structural change, I think. What that should evolve if it's going to over time. I think there is scope for our partnership for TWIP to have a more recognised, a more formal status. I don't think there's any need to rush that. As long as we're constructively working on how that can come about. I mean, it reports to this board at the moment. If it's going to have a greater standing, and I think it should, I think we need to think about its place in the governance as well as Health and Wellbeing Board's place in the governance. Both those need to be thought through carefully. The place and neighbourhood issue. Yes, TWIP operates at the place level in terms of Telford and Wrekin, but for us in Telford and Wrekin, that neighbourhood level is really important. And I think when it comes to that, we need to look at how the partners collaborate at that neighbourhood level to make sure that we can really make a difference there. And there are capacity issues, I recognise, in terms of, you know, numbers of meetings and that people can reasonably get to. But we have to think that through. We have to make sure that neighbourhood level is working effectively, because we have a number of deprived communities in Telford and Wrekin where we desperately need that level of focus. So thank you very much, David, for the presentation. I found that really useful.
Thank you, Andy. Ian?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. The gentleman was asking for our views on this. I must admit I'm very loath to go all the way to a formal merger or acquisition. In the years that I've lived here in Telford and Wrekin, I've seen formal mergers of our hospital with the Shrewsbury Hospital, and then that seems to have been an absolute disaster with the things that are coming out now about how the hospital system is being run, and also we're now going through the CCG proposed merger, which I think is a mistake. I think that should support the informal working arrangements, and so that there is this willingness to work together rather than being forced to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Karen?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to echo what Andy said, really, and also the comments made about community-based first. Obviously, the makeup and the geography of Shropshire is totally different to what it is like in Telford and Wrekin. And as Andy said, we have a lot of deprived areas. So I think, you know, focusing on that community base is a good idea. And also, I think what Ian said about, you know, perhaps keeping it informal and seeing how things progress from there, because it is a bit of a concern that you know, you just wonder where some of the finances is going to go. And you know, obviously we are concerned about some of our areas, and we have got quite a high population and dense population, and as Andy said before about the fact that we have got a lot of deprived areas, so therefore the care is different, I think, obviously in different areas compared to a sprawled rural area compared to an urban area, and different health issues that you have. So you know, I do think that community-based led, and also what Ian said, I think I sort of agree a little bit with that, keeping it a bit more informal to start with, and see how things work out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. David, do you want to come back to any of that?
No, thank you. No, I think all of those comments are pretty much in line with the views I was picking up in the conversations I've had so far. So what the next step will be to bring back conversations like these to the ICS board from all the organisations involved, and we'll see whether that is the general view. But yeah, what you've said so far very much echoes what I picked up in the individual conversations I had prior to drafting the paper.
Thank you. Barry? You're on mute, Barry. Can we take Barry off mute?
Can you hear me?
There you go. We got you.
No, absolutely. Okay.
We've got you, Barry. We can hear you.
Oh, you got me. Just when we talk about informality and collaboration, all fantastic things, but from my experience, sometimes informality too much leads to inconsistency. So you've got to have a consistent approach with your informality, and somewhere along the line, that collaborative approach has to be agreed. So yes, by all means, at neighbourhood informal networks, but from my experience, informality leads to inconsistencies. So just bear that in mind, please.
Thank you, Barry. Anybody else? No? We're good. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. That's the end of the meeting. And the next one is the 10th of September. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Kelly.